Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Curry, and I'm the first Vice President of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. And as Canada's largest general farm organization, CFA speaks with a unified voice for roughly 200,000 Canadian farm families from coast to coast to coast. We're really pleased to host today's webinar on 5G in Canadian agriculture. Before we get started, I just wanted to note our thanks to Telus for working with us to arrange this and supporting the interpretation that helps ensure we can make this available to as wide an audience as possible. Today's subject is an important topic of discussion for CFA because we know that digitization, data analytics, and the connectivity that support innovations in these areas are critical to the competitiveness and productivity of Canadian agriculture. At the same time, we're all too aware of the constraints farmers across the country continue to highlight in terms of their ability to connect and fully engage in this space. Speed, reliability, affordability, and field level connectivity all come up time and time again as concerns, while we continue to hear that the future is in 5G. That's why I'm excited to moderate today's discussions, bringing together a range of experts and perspectives to speak to some of the opportunities, the challenges, and next steps needed to fully embrace and leverage 5G connectivity in Canadian agriculture. On today's panel, we have four exciting speakers who I'll briefly introduce before we get started. Jacob Glick is the Vice President, Public Policy at Telus, a Senior Executive Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and a global leader on complex issues at the intersection of technology, public policy, and law. He brings more than 15 years of experience in technology and telecommunications law and policy. Before joining Telus, Jacob spent time at North Inc., Rogers Communications, and at Google. Helen Hambley also joins us today, and she is a professor in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development in the Ontario Agriculture College at the University of Guelph. Her research focuses on information, knowledge, and communication for agriculture, environment, and rural economic development. Professor Hambley leads the Regional and Rural Broadband, or R2B2, which is Canada's largest and oldest action research project focused on agriculture and rural broadband infrastructure. Alex Menetchuk is Chief Technology Officer, Digital Agriculture at Olds College. He holds his PhD in Agriculture Sciences and second master's degree Soils and Environmental Sciences, and backed up by 25 years of work experience at the international level. Alex leads Olds College Digital Ag Strategy and the development of digital ag platform at Olds College Smart Farm, a 2,800-acre technology-enabled applied research and learning environment. And Leah Olson is a visionary leader with over 20 years experience in building and leading high-performing teams in the private and public sectors right across Canada. She currently leads the Prairie Agriculture Machinery Institute as its president and CEO. Leah's prior roles include CEO of Dot Technology Corp, CEO of Seedmaster Manufacturing, President of the Agriculture Manufacturers of Canada, and various senior management roles in pharmaceutical and rail industries. But first, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping for everyone who's on the call today. I'm going to lead a moderated discussion for the next 25 minutes before opening the discussion up to webinar participants for questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question, please post it in the Q&A section and direct it to an individual speaker or speakers to help us move things along. At the conclusion of the moderated portion, I'll read those questions to the panelists, and we'll get through as many as we can with the time we have available. Panelists may also write in responses if they choose to. For questions in French, Francois Marchand from Telus will be helping us out by translating them into English to read to the panelists. There also is, I believe, a translation or interpretation button at the bottom of the screen that you can choose your language of choice as well. So with that out of the way, let's get to it. And I'd like to start off with a question to Jacob first, just to ensure we all have a common understanding of what we're discussing today. So today's discussion centers around 5G. Jacob, what is 5G? How is it different from, say, 4G, 3G, satellite, and other types of connectivities that we see today?
Well, thanks very much for having me, Keith, and thank you to all the panelists as well for participating. I first want to acknowledge that I'm coming from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples. And it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. When we talk a lot about 5G, and we sometimes forget, well, what is it? Very simply, it is the latest generation of wireless networking technology that uses wireless spectrum to connect devices and computers seamlessly to allow for new innovative communications. And the G is just stands for generation. It's the fifth generation of these wireless technologies. So the first generation that allowed for real data to be transmitted over wireless networks, the first time your phone got data was 2G. With 3G, it got fast. You were able to not just send text, but pictures, access to websites. All of a sudden, with 4G LTE, these are just technology standards. You could access videos while you're on the go, watch YouTube or Netflix when you're in the car while not driving. And what 5G will enable, because the speeds of 5G connections will be up to 100 times faster in some cases, it can connect and transmit vastly more data at much more intense speeds. And that allows a huge opportunity for the kinds of applications and technologies that will be available, not just in urban areas, but in rural and remote areas, and including on farms. In addition to being much faster, 5G has the characteristics in terms of what it permits at the network layer to allow for very low latency applications, which means that it's very well suited for things like autonomous vehicles or autonomous farm equipment, and having many, many more orders of magnitude more devices connected to the network. So again, sensors, smart farms. So all of these technologies come together: faster speeds, lower latency, more sensors, more data, all connected over a ubiquitous network that's not just intended for urban applications, but for rural and remote applications. So that's the Reader's Digest version of 5G, but I'm sure we'll discuss it more as our conversation unfolds.
Well, thanks very much, Jacob. And I know many of us are quite used to letting these terms just roll off our tongues, but maybe not necessarily knowing exactly what those terms are. So thanks for that explanation. That sets up the day very well. So now that we know about what 5G is, I'm going to turn to Alex and Leah. And for the two of you, how will 5G help the agricultural sector and rural communities? And what kinds of equipment, software, and other use cases does it enable? And I'll start with Alex, and then I'll follow with Leah. So Alex?
That was great. Thanks, Keith. First of all, thanks for such a great introduction, and Jacob for a great overview of what 5G is. And like from my standpoint, 5G brings a new important dimension to the game. So we need both connectivity, and we also need high-speed internet everywhere, in the field, on the farm, and so on. So the importance of high speed, I'd probably say it's like a chicken and egg thing. I heard many times, okay, could you give us some examples how 5G can be used? And there are, well, it's still work in progress. There are not too many big use cases so far, just because there was no high-speed internet in rural areas previously. So that infrastructure simply didn't exist. But the potential of that is huge. So I believe that having good connectivity with high-speed internet will change the whole vision for digital agriculture, and it will give a huge boost to the development of new technologies. In a certain way, we're in the rural internet infrastructure, we're in a very similar situation as we were in early 90s with our internet, when I was sitting in front of my Pentium 1 computer, sending emails and sharing, submitting publications for the proceedings of conferences. I thought, wow, that's so great. But there was no video streaming, no remote education, no internet telephones, no real-time sharing documents, no social networking, nothing. So, but then when the infrastructure for that was developed, everything changed. Smartphones and high-speed internet changed everything. So last couple of years during the COVID pandemic, like we've seen so many great examples how the technology can make our life easier. So let's just think about some potential amazing applications and tools that can become real with 5G available in the field. Of course, like video communication between agronomists and scientists. If somebody needs to identify diseases, weeds, insects, real-time taking pictures with a smartphone or streaming video and communicating within the community of the scientists and agronomists, making kind of social networking, professional networking that way, that will change a lot. Or instant data transfer between field sensors, IoT platforms, users. Connecting or collecting real-time yield data and selling yield from the combine. If, for example, I have a sensor determining determining protein content in wheat, I can know upfront, and I can probably sell my yield with a higher premium if I have higher protein. If I grow malt barley, I need lower protein, and I will know that right away, and that will change the trading industry completely. Or, for example, when I manage livestock real-time, detecting cattle with potential or existing health problems. Everything can be done real-time, and all those applications, they're not possible with the existing high-speed internet and the infrastructure required for that. So in fact, there will be so many exciting changes and additional applications, including managing autonomous equipment and connecting field sensors and many other things that I was just mentioning. And I'm really glad and proud to say that both Olds College and Telus are working together on setting up the 5G network on the smart farm at Olds. And I think this is one of the things that will open the new opportunities for the industry.
Great, thanks, Alex. And unfortunately, I'm of the vintage where I remember the dark ages of no cell phones and no social media too. So certainly we've seen a lot of changes over our lifetime. Leah, maybe if you can also chime in here and answer those questions, because you actually are hands on the ground and dealing with, as I refer to, where the rubber hits the road, and dealing with how we can use this on farm very specifically. So maybe you have some examples of how this is going to benefit us going forward.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks. I mean, Alex gave such a thorough answer. And just to add on to some of what he's talking about, I think from a manufacturing perspective, you're always challenged by what sort of network does a farmer have on his or her, within their land. And as a kid that grew up in literally the middle of nowhere in the sandy areas of southwestern Saskatchewan, where I know even today there's not a lot of network coverage. When you start looking at the different sensors and the different sizes of data that is being collected, it's a constant question of how do you ensure that operation is fully optimized. So one of the benefits I think that manufacturers are looking forward to, and that many at least in Twitterverse is the ability to do remote support. So, for dealerships or for manufacturers to be able to get in directly and say, I can do a problem resolution. And part of the time that I had at Dot Technology and in working with other ag tech companies, like that represents a very large opportunity because on some of the operating systems, try as you might, I'm not saying that this is really unique to any of the companies that I have been associated with. However, try as you might to make sure that you've got all of the kinks worked out. Inevitably, there will be something that'll go out and you're just not sure how that has occurred. So when I think about, what does 5G offer to the agriculture industry, the bandwidth is really important, because right now for the opportunity to go to precision agriculture and to take a camera and look at where are all of the weeds, what is the stage of growth of my canola, and I apologize, I'm going to talk more grain. That's a tremendous amount of data. And so as Jacob was referencing, that 5G is this ubiquitous, beautiful network that will be used for both agriculture and for urban. On the agriculture side, there's big business that still is at play. And I know Helen will talk a bit about some of her research on this area, but I see that as being a really big opportunity that is currently not being maximized because we quite simply can't. Now, what does that mean? Well, for anybody that is told that they can't do it, if they're an entrepreneur, they're going to find a way. So then innovation becomes our path forward. And I think what we've seen and where we're seeing some really big changes in ag tech is because there is not 5G across North America. And so we've been able to, we've been forcing some of the entrepreneurs and some of the farmers, quite frankly, to make do and to find different ways to solve some of the solutions. So that's in a nutshell, that's what I see. I do see that there's lots of opportunities. I applaud Telus for getting involved in agriculture. I never thought in my lifetime I'd see a telecom and agriculture sort of combined as Telus Ag. So kudos to Telus and to Jacob and the team there for recognizing the opportunities and getting invested.
Great, thanks, Leah. I know we're all excited, and it sounds like there is some great opportunities and potential with this technology. So I'm gonna shift over to Helen and maybe Jacob to follow. The real question we all want an answer to, Helen, is how far away are we from getting widespread 5G connectivity on the farm? And maybe you can also touch on what some of the key obstacles to establish it in Canada are.
Yeah, thanks very much, Keith, and to the previous speakers. It's a terrific launch into this important discussion. So, Keith, we're really far right now using the most recent CRTC data from 2019. 54% of rural Canada lack access to 50 megabits per second down, 10 megabits per second up. That's called our basic service in Canada, and current policy and programs are aiming to fill that gap by Ontario 2025, 26, and nationally 2030. And that point of time 50-10 is just not going to cut it. So we're way behind in our ambitions in digital connectivity in rural areas, and this should be of great concern in the ag sector. Right now, we know that rural users spend 3 times the price, so they have 3 times more expensive for very much inferior quality of service, and yet rural communities are providing about 30% of our national GDP. So there's really some disconnects here that have to be addressed. We're living with, the unintended effects of old policies, particularly where 5G is concerned because of the need for spectrum. 5G operates on high radio frequencies, and these frequencies become available under license through a spectrum auction. We've just had one auction last year, and we're in the process of another one that's doing consultations. And ag voices need to be heard in these policy processes, because spectrum will be allocated to companies who perhaps will not use it and will not lose it. And this principle of not using and not losing really hurts the available spectrum that 5G networks need. As well, we have major investments in the infrastructure, such as fiber optics, that are entirely complementary to 5G. And so real strategic thinking about these very high cost investments is also needed in terms of the evolving 5G landscape. So long and short of it is, we need to update our policy frameworks. We need to think forward and make sure that our decisions are future-proofed where 5G is concerned. And just an aside, I spoke to a major agri-food stakeholder organization a month or so ago, who said that he was driving, this fellow was driving from Regina to Saskatchewan and couldn't even get a 3G signal. and it was a time when it's really busy. You needed to make calls. So we are behind the ball in many parts of rural Canada where connectivity is concerned, and we need to make some progress on this, and very soon.
Great, and maybe Jacob, if you can just follow up and without getting too political, maybe help outline maybe some of the barriers that a company like Telus might see as far as getting 5G more frequently, and also there was a question referring to that in the Q&A about how quickly and what do you need, more towers, for example, bigger. More power to broadcast, whatever the case may be. So maybe you can just touch on that as a potential barrier or opportunity to getting 5G quicker.
Sure. Thanks, Keith. So firstly, I want to echo the point that Helen made. And it's really important to underscore, emphasize, flashing lights this point, which is that wireless spectrum is the core public resource over which all wireless networks run. And wireless spectrum, as I said, is a public resource allocated by the government with licenses to telecommunications companies like Telus and others. And because it's a public resource, it's meant to be used for the purposes that it's allocated. That is to provide service. But actually what's happening in real life today is that there are many companies who have received spectrum licenses, often at a significant discount to what Telus paid for various public policy reasons, and who are just sitting on those licenses. And it has a material adverse consequence to the speeds and the services that rural Canadians receive. And I'll give you a very specific example, because Helen noted that there are many people, even in today's 4G networks, who are not receiving 50/10 internet, 50 megabits down, 10 megabits up. We actually have the technology in 4G. So forget about 5G for a second. This conversation about 5G, and that's aspirational, and it's coming soon to a farm near you. But even today, Telus could provide 50 megabits as a wireless high-speed internet access service in rural areas where there is not fiber optic cable. So just so you know, in like deep into rural and remote areas of BC and Alberta, we've built fiber optic networks. We rolled out those fiber optic networks first in rural communities in Alberta and BC before we went to the big urban centers. But in some places where it doesn't make sense or the topology doesn't work, we have a wireless high-speed service where you put a modem in your house. It accesses the cell network, but then it's like, Wi-Fi in your house, the same, right? We only provide a 25 megabit service because we don't have enough spectrum to provide a better quality service than 25 megabits in those areas. Even though there is another company that I won't name in this call. So to your admonition, Keith, to not be political, I won't shame that other company who has spectrum, who is sitting on it, and who has had it for over a decade and is doing nothing with it, to the detriment of rural Canadians. And so as the government is allocating 5G spectrum, which they did a little bit last summer, and which they're going to do again next year, they really need to think, how do we make sure we allocate that spectrum in a way that maximizes the benefits that individual Canadians can experience, so that the carriers who are building out the networks can spend the money, build out the networks, make sure that everyone has an absolutely world-class service, so that we can get all of the kinds of benefits of remote learning and remote healthcare and all of these on-farm services that Alex was talking about. And funny enough, I'll make the one last point, and then I'll let you. We'll keep going, which is that the other thing that is a challenge in this context and an obstacle is the price of spectrum. So in this auction that I described that happened last summer, Canadian carriers like Telus paid the highest fees in the world for the 5G spectrum that they purchased on auction from the federal government. They spent in total just last summer $9 billion. Okay, $9 billion is what is also estimated it would take in dollars to connect every single rural Canadian to high-speed broadband. So instead of spending the money on building out the networks further and deeper, that capital was allocated to writing a giant check to the federal treasury, to the receiver general, and not spending it on farms and in rural communities.
Well, we could talk about that last sentence forever and a day, certainly about governments and what we need in rural Canada as far as infrastructure goes. But certainly your points are valid for those of us that are in the lobby world, as we're advocating for expansion of connectivity throughout rural Canada, on how and it also leads into the next question, which I'm going to open up to all the panelists, and that is, what can governments do to expedite getting 5G on farm? And I know you just touched on a little bit, Jacob, but what role can we do to help government get that expansion quicker? And also, and this refers also to a question in the Q&A, is what role can the private sector, for example, private ISPs do to support this? And maybe Helen, I'll start with you on this.
Right. So, so listen, Keith. There's a lot happening in the policy world right now around these issues, and certainly it's not going to happen without public-private partnership, in my opinion. So, private sector can do a lot, and they are certainly crucial in connecting every single Canadian, urban or rural. But going forward, the public sector, all levels of government have to be involved. Some of the best change has also been happening from municipalities taking a lead role in making sure that change happens. But municipalities also can't do it alone. They need the provinces and territories and the federal government to coordinate and get on the same page. And this affects agriculture. And this is why I believe we need a national agricultural broadband strategy in this country, which is completely dovetailed with the rural connectivity strategy and policy and program investments that are rolling out. Here in Ontario, there's $4 billion in play to connect every rural Ontarian. But there's much smaller contributions across other provinces and territories. And so the resources from the public sector, vary greatly. But at the same time, agriculture is absolutely crucial to our national economy as well as our provincial economies. So in calling for a dedicated initiative around this, not dissimilar from what USDA in the United States and in the US, the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Working Group has done to really dive into the issues, find out what's going right, what's going wrong. Connectivity is a whole set of different technologies, and 5G is one of them, very crucial one. Let's make sure that Canada is climbing up from our current 22nd position in 5G readiness. It's a real concern. So I'll start with that and then to see what our other colleagues there think about the question.
Thanks, Helen, and maybe Leo, I'll jump over to you as someone that deals with the practicality on the ground of this. How do we push this along from your perspective? Is there something small we can start with and then maybe build on, or how do you see this working to get expedited service through rural Canada?
Oh, any hard questions? I was going to refer them to Helen. On this one, the comment that Jacob made on the spectrum auctions, that is public assets. And I believe that there is wording in there that requires that the spectrum be used within a certain amount of time. And Jacob, if I'm wrong on that, by all means, let me know. But that is kind of where I think we've got to ask ourselves, like, we've been selling spectrum for over 20 years, 30, 40. And I think the first minister to promise rural connectivity was the Honorable John Manley in early 2000s. And I remember at the time I was living in Montreal, and I didn't really care about it, to be honest. I cared because of my farm background, and I love being able to use my phone anywhere. But now that I'm living in a very rural area, I find it frustrating that after all of these years, after all of the spectrum that has been sold, and it has been sold, all of the telecoms are spending big dollars on access and being able to purchase the spectrum. So I think from a public policy perspective, we have to ask ourselves, do we have the right conditions in place for the sale of that spectrum? And it is, I mean, I choose to live in a rural area, but as a business person, one of the biggest challenges I have right now is I can't attract good, high skilled people. And furthermore, when I get onto video calls, I just pray that my internet holds up. And when I'm on the road from our office in Humboldt, Saskatchewan to Portage la Prairie, Manitoba, there are absolutely areas I can't do phone calls in. And I find that frustrating. And so, the question, I think, in terms of what does this provide to the agriculture industry, my view is that it means there's a very untapped opportunity, because we simply can't, right? And so when we look at what the work that Olds is doing with the smart farm, they've got access and they've got a little more connectivity, I think, as a result of their good partnership with Telus. But the reality is that on farms, like, we don't have that. And so there might, if your drill drops down and, it's not functioning properly, you're calling into your dealer and your phone goes dead. I mean, that's very, very basic. And that's some of the basic stuff that in the rural areas is simply not happening. And so we're looking for solutions though. So what role can the private sector? I mean, I think that it's to look at, what we've started to look at is satellite technology for both business purposes and for others, because it is reliable. But, there's definitely a challenge from a public policy perspective, and I'm not offering up any solutions. This is free though, right? Like, I give my opinion free.
Yeah, no, it's something that, for, as I mentioned, for someone that's on the lobby side of things, and we were all excited when then Finance Minister Murnau announced connectivity by 2030 for everybody in Canada, and monies to go with that. We're all excited, but what we don't always understand is what's the background behind actually getting to that. What are the stumbling blocks? What do we need to do? So, Alex, I'm wondering, from someone that is in academia but has practicality as well in having a smart farm experience, anything else that you might be able to add that might help us to expedite this connectivity problem that we have right now?
Well, I wished I had a crystal ball. Unfortunately, I see that as an evolution. I would probably say it will. Unfortunately, I understand all those concerns that Lear just brought up to the table, and I can sign off on every statement. Like, if you're doing field work in the middle of nowhere in Saskatchewan and you don't have a SaskTel connection, you don't have anything. So I think eventually everything will be evolving in a similar way, like Wi-Fi coverage in urban areas evolved. So 10 years ago, Wi-Fi was limited to a small number of hotspots. Now in urban areas, wherever you go, well, you can find a hotspot. Like, you go to a resort and you can have Wi-Fi even somewhere on the beach. And 10 years ago, that was a luxury. So I think connectivity will evolve in a very similar way. So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but one of the questions was about LoRaWAN. So I think it will be a coexistence of several technologies, including LoRaWAN, including satellite internet, including 5G mobile internet, depending on what that technology best suits for. I think they will evolve, and I think we'll get there same way as we did with Wi-Fi, same way we ended up driving nice cars. So unfortunately, nothing happens in one day, especially in such a complicated and complex industry as agriculture.
Yes, that is very true, and I don't know whether you have anything briefly to add on to that, Jacob, or not. But there also was a question in the Q&A that kind of related to this about sort of the process that a company like a Telus might take, and that is starting maybe perhaps with some nodes in certain areas and building up from that. So I don't know if you want to build on that at all.
Sure. So firstly, I think it's been well articulated by the other panelists that this is a matter of both a public responsibility and a private responsibility. The private companies, like the Teluses of the world, we have the responsibility to build the networks and build them out in the most robust way possible, in the furthest reaches that we possibly can, and to the extent that it's not possible, to partner with government to build even further, to ensure that every single Canadian has access to high-speed broadband and can enjoy the social and economic opportunities that come from access to that. And that includes for our farmers who are making such important investments in sustainable agriculture, in precision agriculture, in making their farms technologically leading in the world. They need the network layer underpinning that. So that is a private accountability for companies like Telus, and a public-private accountability in places where there just is not an economic case to build. And then secondly, there is a very short-term action that the government is taking now that people should be aware of, which is that I told you that there was 5G spectrum that was auctioned off this past summer. The other component of that 5G spectrum, the government is consulting on it right now. So they need to hear from Canadians who don't necessarily care about spectrum, who don't play in telecommunications every day, but who need the outcomes. Who need the outcomes of what the networks can deliver. They need to hear from you to say, we need networks that allow for the kind of ubiquitous connectivity and the kinds of high speeds that we're describing. So, to go back to what we were discussing before, when Telus fully deploys its 5G spectrum, ultimately with what we purchased at auction last year and what we hope to purchase in the upcoming auction, we'll be able to provide 100 megahertz coverage, 100 megabit coverage in your house, wireless high-speed internet access. So that means that everyone in your house and on your farm can stream Netflix and talk to their teacher and talk to their doctor all at the same time, just like you do in downtown Edmonton or downtown Toronto. So, and then on the farms, you'll have all the benefits that we talked about in terms of sensors and remote access and augmented reality and self-driving vehicles. All of those things will be made possible if the government allocates the spectrum right. And there are certain, from our perspective, certain things that carriers need for that. We need 100 megahertz of this 5G spectrum. We need that spectrum to be in big, thick blocks. This is starting to get technical, but so that we have the biggest channels to have the fastest speeds. And we need what Leah and Helen were talking about, which is we need the government to put use it or lose it conditions on that spectrum so that the companies that are building the networks aren't held hostage by the companies that are just sitting on spectrum. And Leah, to your point, yes, there are build out conditions on spectrum today, but many of those conditions are 10, 15 years long for some companies. And frankly, we don't have 10, 15 years to wait, right? And so we're saying in our submissions to government, 3 to 5 years to use it or lose it. And if you're not going to build the network, then have it re-auctioned and let somebody who's going to use it get the benefit of it, because ultimately it's a public resource.
Great point. If it's okay with the panelists, we did get started a little bit late. Hopefully everyone was able to stay on maybe a little bit past our initial stops time, just because we did get started late. It's an excellent discussion, and I'd like to make sure we give it the full amount of time that we can to continue on. There is a question in the Q&A, and I'll maybe start with you, Leah, and because I think you can probably relate to it much like I can, and that is about, and I know that others, including Jacob, can jump in on this, but there is a question about the inherent fear that all of us farmers have, and that is our data getting stolen. You know, somebody coming in and hacking the system, or all those bad actors out there. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, Lee, if you actually see that as an issue, or are there things that we can do to mitigate that reality from happening?
Yeah, I think so. You know, there's always the challenge of hackers, and I think that, you know, on the farm, most of the data, there's an agreement when you purchase a piece of equipment as to who owns the data, and so when manufacturers are looking at the security of their systems, I know that they do take that into consideration. and so that's a definitely from a reliability perspective, you want to ensure that you've got a top-notch operating system. And there are, I can't, great question. If I had known that, I would have studied a bit up on some of the programming that is required. And it's an agreement, it's a voluntary agreement that anybody that is in the autonomous area, that their programmers agree to, ethical programming and making sure that there is top-notch security, because you are dealing with people's data. And so I believe strongly in the people that are, doing that. And the other part is that you have to also have your intellectual property in such a state that, and this is a big debate within the agriculture industry, I know that, if your operating system goes wonky, who can repair it? And on that front, the organizations, they try to ensure that that they're pushing updates out on a regular basis and monitoring the performance of those, so that farmers' data is always very secure.
Excellent. Maybe Helen, from your perspective, if you can follow up, Leah, with that question.
Yeah, Leah is absolutely correct in how she's seeing things at that user level, and higher, faster data throughput and secure systems are entirely linked. A lot of the advances in security, particularly through fields like quantum computing, aren't possible on really old, antiquated, slow systems. So, we really do need our networks to be advanced, to be able to gain those security advantages. And then also within the Internet of Agriculture, Internet of Things agriculture, so in multiple devices, multiple sensors, systems and architectures like 5G have a comparative advantage, because they are faster, they're more reliable, they can be always on, and more easily backed up. So data loss is also a crucial aspect of datification of agriculture. So not just by malicious or hacking, but just losing crucial data, particularly at a point in the growing season when that would cost you quite a bit. And I'm sure Alex might have some good examples of what happens when you lose data on farm.
Excellent segue, and I'll go to you to respond as well, Alex. But even things for those of us on the ground as farmers, there are many out there who are afraid that even the manufacturers are grabbing our data. And I think understanding that they're not really necessarily interested in my specific data, but more the aggregate data, is always a tough message to get across. But maybe Alex, you can jump in here and give us some perspective as well.
Yeah, of course. I don't want to be, or I don't want to pretend to be an expert in cybersecurity. I'm not. I'm just talking from agricultural slash technical standpoint. I think, Keith, you're 100% right. In most cases, it will be somewhat similar to the discussion about data privacy and social networking. Like some companies that you voluntarily leave your data for, they use your data to target commercials or to offer you something. I think in a certain way you cannot eliminate something like that in the industry, but at the same time, I still see more benefits in case if you can share the data. Like hacking the networks, that's completely different. Hacking, in many cases, it's targeted, and the agricultural industry is kind of a narrow niche. So if someone wants to have your personal information, that will be way more serious than just collecting the information about your yield or something like that. And that will be more about finding your vulnerable business sites or something like that. I don't know. Like I would probably use I would quote one of the leading edge growers, like in terms of accessing the data and data privacy. He said in one of the conferences that, I keep hearing, oh, if John Deere has access to my data, what John Deere is going to do. said, yeah, I know what they're going to do. They will build a better tractor. So in most cases, we shouldn't look for any conspiracy in accessing the data, but the data is an instrument to improve our life. It's not necessarily a tool to undermine something.
Yeah, I think it's as much to do about marketing and building the right equipment for our needs to serve our needs. You're absolutely right. And maybe Jacob, if I can just get you to just maybe to finish up on this subject matter, and as a person in the actual telecommunications field, you know, your perspective on cybersecurity with respect to what we're doing out there in rural Canada. And even in the questions, there was a reference to a company that we all know of that we have heard some not so favorable comments about security. Maybe just from your perspective as a company that deals with this, is there things that we can do, or things that you as a company are doing to help make sure that our stuff is safe out there?
Sure. So the first is, everything that Telus does is built on the principles of privacy by design and security by design. And those are, those aren't just catchphrases, they are well-designed accountability frameworks that Telus has been a national and world leader in implementing. And so that's true across all of the products and services that we are offering to Canadians in both in this field and elsewhere. So that's a starting point. The second thing is, I think it's true that ubiquitous high-speed networked technologies raise novel security concerns, but in a way, we also forget about the very endemic security problems of the old way of computing. What I mean by that is, so I've worked in IT policy for most of my career, and people used to think that, like, oh, if I open the door to the server room and I see the computer on the floor and the lights are blinking, then, like, I know where the data is, and I know that it's safe, and I know that it's in control because I can open the door and I see the lights blinking on the server. But that is illusory control. That data is just as at risk, probably more at risk if it's on a computer in your house in the closet than it is if you are using the most modern, most up-to-date services provided by globally relevant vendors. So I think part of understanding how to balance all of these trade-offs is thinking about assessing risk holistically and not just assuming that new things are risky, but balancing that against the inherent risk of actually continuing to do something that itself was risky, but you had become inured to.
Excellent. Thanks very much to all the panelists for that question, because I know, as we go around the country and we talk to our members out there, certainly security is one of the top questions, or one of the top concerns that we see and hear about every day. So that's why I didn't mind spending a little bit more time on this area, this subject matter, just to make sure that people have a general understanding of what we're dealing with out there. So thank you to you all. I'm trying to respect the time. Probably will run a few minutes over what we originally scheduled, but I have been trying to monitor the questions in the Q&A, and I think we've covered a lot of them. I don't know if any of the panelists have any specific questions in there that they would like to address that we haven't already addressed. If there is, let me know. And if not, I'd like to go around to each of the panelists sort of to give some concluding remarks. Helen, did you want to jump in on one of the questions?
Yeah, I saw one there, and maybe I could start off this final round, Keith. That was a really good question, which is like, what would it look like to see 5G on farms? And I think we need to even think bigger. I think we need to think about agribusiness parks, agricultural transportation hubs, or hubs that are moving things to the farm and off the farm in relationship to 5G. We need to think about research and demonstration farms being 5G connected across the country, so that science and research results reach farmers in a timely way, and that farmers can really direct and be at the center of science going forward in agriculture agriculture and agri-food systems. So the landscapes of connected farms is absolutely correct, that farms themselves are connected, but then there's a lot of other crucial rural connections and agri-food connections that need to be made going forward. So no, the pandemic has really set us all back, but it's taught us that we have to think to the future and really approach this issue head on. Thanks.
Well, those are excellent points. And I've long said that this isn't just about agriculture connectivity, it's about rural and especially rural communities. My business and all our farm businesses depend on the services that support us, whether it's an equipment dealer, whether it's a welder, it could be a nutritionist, it could be a veterinarian. We need all these support services and our communities to be strong around them, and that will require them to have that high-speed connection as well. So excellent point that you raised there. Leah, any final comments that you may want to make before we sign off here?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a great topic, and I'll go back to whenever there is a problem, that's when we see the greatest of innovation. And so I'm perhaps a bit different from some of the other panelists in terms of where I see this, because from a manufacturer's, when I was, clearly I'm with PAMI now and happily so. And we work with a lot of ag techs who are at the forefront of trying to figure out how do we get all of this precision, these precise, pieces of data or of photos. Sorry, I'm mixing things up. They'll use a lot of LiDAR, radar, and then that collects so much data that in our traditional systems are not able to be accepted. And so we're looking at different ways to be able to translate that into something that makes sense and can be used by the farmer to save her money, to save her time, whatever it is, to optimize her or his farm operations. And I think that what we have seen in the pandemic is that you don't have to physically be there. And so in light of the 5G conversation, there are some major manufacturers that are jumping towards, 5G is going to be the be all and end all. And they're jumping over to that, which means that some of the 3G network, it just simply won't speak within that environment. But what I am hopeful for is that we will start to see, farmers be able to access, wireless or virtual connectivity in ways that allows them to be in the middle of a beautiful nowhere Saskatchewan and still get the service that they need to keep that air seeder or that harvester or that sprayer running. And right now we're so dependent on, where are the towers and where is my dealer, that we're seeing some down days, which hopefully we in 5 years from now we won't. And at Olds College, they're looking at some really great ways to make sure that happens. So
Yeah, interesting comments, and certainly for the labor gaps we're seeing right through the industry, but especially on farm, that connectivity can even help alleviate some of those labor issues that we're dealing with too. And that we unfortunately don't have time to dive into even that subject, but very important. Alex, any final closing comments?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I just want to circle back to the very first comment I made today about the chicken and egg thing. So now we're building the infrastructure for something, and I think it will change the whole vision for digitalization of agriculture. So I have no doubts that there will be way more opportunities in the future, way more new companies and new businesses growing up around the connectivity and the internet connection. Just using an example from the smart farm at Olds College, 3-4 years ago, when the smart farm was started, it was just a piece or several pieces of land and a number of motivated people. Now everything grew up into a large smart ag ecosystem. So let's have a chat in 5 years and we'll see how everything will change. Hopefully everything that Jacob was bringing up to the discussion, I think all those problems will be addressed. Let's try to be positive and optimistic, and we'll have a chat in 5 years you will not recognize the ag industry. That's my word.
Well, I hope you're wrong. I hope it's sooner, but if it's 5 years, that would be wonderful. Jacob,
Agriculture is seasonal.
yeah, for sure. Jacob, I'll give the last word to you. Certainly, as someone who represents Telus that is helping host this webinar, maybe some final thoughts on the whole subject matter of 5G and anything that you think we should be aware of that's coming down the pipe that maybe we haven't talked about today.
Sure. Thanks, Keith, and thanks also to fellow panelists for a really thoughtful conversation. And we could probably talk for much longer, and so next time with beer, I hope, in person. A comment was raised in the Q. There's a lot of really good questions in the Q&A. A comment was raised in the Q&A. What do we do about people who can't afford the broadband service? And I think that's an important conversation to not go unspoken to. And so, Telus is a social purpose company. The reason why we are deploying our considerable resources, human ingenuity into the ag sector is because we know that Canadian farmers, the Canadian agriculture business is one of the most innovative sectors in the world. And we know together we can help accelerate many of the transformations that Canadian farmers have already begun in terms of precision agriculture, in terms of sustainability, in terms of helping to feed the world, right? These are important social missions aligned with a social purpose company. Part of being a social purpose company is bridging the digital divide. That's what the aspect of rural connectivity is also a component of, because it's not just digital divides in urban centers, it's the rural urban digital divide, as many of our communities, our schools, our healthcare centers in rural Canada are being left behind because of the lack of access to broadband. And as part of that, companies like Telus bear a responsibility to ensure that there are services that are available to everyone in those communities. And so we have, for example, in all the places where we have fiber optic, including in rural communities, we have services for significantly subsidized high-speed broadband for seniors who are on the guaranteed income supplement, to children who are aging out of foster care, to all sorts of vulnerable people in our society, to families who are on who meet that minimum threshold for the child benefit, or who get the maximum child benefit. We have subsidized broadband programs for all of these groups and more, because bridging that digital divide is an important component. And as we build out these wireless high-speed networks, I think it's incumbent upon companies like Telus to continue to expand those programs, because that's, I think, what a good social purpose company does today and will do in the future. And so I hope that is an optimistic note, that we can have these inclusive societies based on ubiquitous high-speed broadband for everyone, rural and urban. And what we need now is, in the very short term, is for people to call the member of parliament and tell them to get the spectrum auction right, so that then you can put the onus on the companies to deliver their part.
Great points, and especially on the social side of things, on that urban-rural divide. And we've been really seeing an exodus of social services in rural Canada, and certainly through better connectivity programs like, for example, Telus Health that may allow us to have better access to services is imperative. So great points to wrap things up, Jacob. I should mention before we wrap up here today, to all the participants and everyone attending, that this recording will be available eventually in the near future on our website. So I'll just wait for all the I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed on the recording, and we'll get it up on the CFA website for so anyone can access it. And so on behalf of CFA, I just want to give a big shout out and thank you to Telus and for putting this on, and to Francois to being on hand in case we needed his help with the interpretation, and to all the panelists. thank you for attending today. I also want to say thank you to the participants who took the time to listen in and write those great questions in the Q&A on this very important topic. And as you heard today, it is an issue that's of critical importance to our producers, the people I represent right across Canada. So let's keep this discussion moving forward. Jacob made a great point at the end about contacting your MP. That's something that I know we'll be doing now that we're much more aware of it. So I'll end on that note, and thank you to everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.